Good evening, friends. I am glad you came. There is nothing in tonight that wants anything from you, and nothing in it worth carrying, so put the light down low and let the rest of it wait outside the door. We have a long one. I want to begin at a rope. It was strung across a dry limestone valley in the south of Egypt in the first months of 1923, and on the wrong side of it stood most of the world's newspapermen. They had come from London and from New York and up from Cairo, by boat and by train, and at the last by donkey, because the largest story on the planet was at the bottom of a hole about 40 feet from where they were standing. And not one of them was going to be allowed to look into it, so they stood in the sun instead. They photographed the outside of a stairway. Some of them, by the end, were photographing each other photographing it. There was a weekly paper in London that had been let inside the arrangement, and in February that year it printed the truest sentence anybody wrote about that valley all season. It described the work as going on to the click of the ubiquitous Kodak against the constant creaking of the crude water wheels which abound in the locality. Hold that sound a moment, because most of what follows came out of it. Shutters, a water wheel, 100 trained writers with a deadline in the morning and nothing, whatever, in the notebook. The idea underneath tonight is a very old one, older than the tomb this turns on. It runs about like this, that the dead are owed their quiet, and that helping yourself to what was laid down beside them asks something back. Not in law, not in any way a person could ever point to. It simply asks. It is among the oldest ideas there is, held in some form in nearly every corner of the world, and held on to right through every century that sat down and patiently explained why it needn't be. What happened in that valley was that the old idea got a date, an address, a photograph, a column of newsprint. Having got them, it walked off the page and kept going. Everybody who stood at that rope is long gone. The story is not. It is believed tonight, quietly, at kitchen tables, by people who could not name one person it is supposed to have touched. So, here is the shape of the night. It begins as a story about a boy with a pencil. It becomes a story about a sick man with a motorcar, then about 16 cut steps under a workman's hut, then about a death in a hotel 5 months later that nobody has ever quite managed to make sound ordinary. I am not going to spoil that stretch for you. It deserves to land the way it landed on everyone else. Only afterward are we going to turn the whole thing over and have a look underneath. Some of tonight sits on paper I can point at. A contract printed in a newspaper, in the paper's own words. A column of plain arithmetic. A card in an archive with the measurements of a very small object written on it in a man's own handwriting. Some of tonight is what people said loudly and could never quite show anybody. A fair amount of it nobody knows and never will. I will tell you which is which as we go, because the not knowing is a good half of why this thing is still walking around. There is one more thing down there, and I'm going to keep it until the end. It is small enough to close a hand around. The whole of tonight rests on it. It is made of mud, and by the time we reach it, I think it will have stopped being frightful altogether. We start 30 years earlier and a long way north. The first thing to know about Howard Carter is that he was taught to look at things by a man being paid by the hour. His father, Samuel Carter, was an animal painter. Not a gentleman with an easel, a working painter, the son of a gamekeeper, which in Norfolk, in the middle of the 1800s, put a family on a very particular rung. the Carters were not the people who owned the land. They were the people the landowners sent for. What Samuel had, instead of acres, was an uncommonly good hand. He could put a horse on canvas so that it was that horse, that one and no other, the way somebody can catch a face in 3 lines. 2 sorts of people paid him for it. The illustrated papers in London took his drawings week after week for the better part of 20 years, while the gentry of Norfolk wanted their hunters and their spaniels up over the dining room fireplace. One of his paintings is in a national collection to this day. Red deer, moving through the first light of the morning, painted in 1876. Howard was the youngest of 11 children, born in London in the spring of 1874, a sickly boy who was never sent away to school. According to the archive that holds his papers, his whole education comes to 2 short phrases. He was, it says, privately educated due to delicate health, then instructed in drawing and painting by his father, an animal artist. That is it. That is the schooling of the man who would open the most famous room in the world. He learned one trade, at his father's elbow, on his father's subjects. You can picture the arrangement without much effort, because it has not changed in any century. A boy sits slightly behind and to one side, close enough to see the brush, but not close enough to be in the way, watching how the light gets onto a flank, how you fake the wet of an eye with 1 dot of white, how long you can leave a line before it goes dead. Nobody explains it. He is simply there for a few thousand hours while it happens. By about 15 he was doing it for money himself. Pet portraits, somebody's dog, somebody's pony, on somebody's carpet for a fee. His biographers say he found the work tedious and reserved a particular loathing for the lapdogs, though I should say plainly that those are their words about him and not his own. He does not seem to have written it down anywhere himself. What is not in dispute is that at an age when other boys were in a classroom, Howard Carter had a trade. The trade was his hand, and his hand went wherever the commission was. And 8 miles from the family's town, in the flat green nothing of West Norfolk, one of those commissions was a house. Didlington Hall belonged to a man who had spent a very large amount of money on Egypt, and what he had built there was not a cabinet of curiosities in a corner of a drawing room. It was a museum wing, put up on purpose, running to something over 2,000 square feet. In the library were 16 books off England's first printing press, and one of the Bibles printed by Gutenberg. Among the Egyptian holdings lay a papyrus that recorded an official inquiry into a run of tomb robberies from the reign of a pharaoh called Rameses IX. A police file, in other words. A police file 3,000 years old, about men going into tombs and taking what was in them, sitting on a shelf in Norfolk. And outside the door of that wing, standing in the wet English grass, were 7 statues of a woman with the head of a lion. They were Sekhmet, a goddess the Egyptians made lion-headed on purpose, carved in dark stone, lifted out of a temple at Karnak and shipped north, one of them for each daughter of the house. 7 of them, taller than a man, at a door in Norfolk. There is no record of what a boy of 15 or 16 thought as he went past them. I am not going to invent one for him. What I can tell you is that he went past them carrying a sketchbook in the rain to draw somebody's dog. He did write about that collection later, and according to Carter himself, it was the thing that turned him. He called it the largest and most interesting of its kind then in England, and said it left him longing for a country he had never seen. The blue of the sky over it, the pale hills, the valleys, with everything still lying in them. That is the whole of the change, smaller than people tend to expect. Nobody offered him a scholarship. He was not discovered. A tradesman's son walked up a gravel drive on an ordinary working day, went past 7 black lionesses standing in the wet, and got a look through a door at another world. And then he went inside and did his father's job. He did not get into Egypt through a door. He was carried in by other people on the strength of 3 letters. The first came from Percy Newberry, an archaeologist who needed somebody cheap and quick with a pen. The second came from Lady Amherst, whose husband owned the house with the lionesses at the door. The third came from Amelia Edwards, a novelist who had more or less invented the business of funding Egyptian excavation out of the pockets of the British public. According to the archive at Oxford, the whole of it comes down to a single flat clause. He joined the Archaeological Survey in the summer of 1891. It says, "On Lady Amherst's recommendation, it is worth sitting with the shape of that for a second, because it is not a fairy tale, and it is not a scandal either." Lord Amherst, the collector whose statues the boy had walked past, sat on the committee of the fund that did the hiring. His name heads the printed list of them in the front of a memoir published 3 years later. The Norfolk gentleman was inside the institution. The Norfolk painter's son was outside it. What crossed the gap between them was a recommendation, which is how a great deal of the world has always worked, neither more nor less honestly than that. They agreed his money in the October of 1891, £50. That is what the committee put down for a season's work in Egypt by a 17-year-old, about £4 a month, which even then was the wage of somebody's assistant. And before he went anywhere at all, he spent that summer in a back room of the British Museum, living at his parents' house, and going in each day to work under Francis Llewellyn Griffith, a scholar there. The job was inking. Newberry had brought back tracings from a row of painted tombs at Beni Hassan, thin paper, faint pencil, lines somebody else had knelt in the dark to take down, and Carter's task was to go over those lines in ink, one at a time, dark enough and even enough that a printing press could hold them. Sit with that too, because it is the answer to the question everybody actually wants answered. How does a painter of dogs end up opening a pharaoh's tomb? He does not for a long time. He starts by finishing another man's line work at a table in London, for a man who will never be famous, on a wall he has never seen. Then the 8 years. 1891 at Beni Hassan, 1892 at the ruined city of Amarna under Flinders Petrie, who was the most exacting excavator then working anywhere in Egypt and who did not hand out compliments. Then 6 straight seasons, from 1893 to 1899, at the great terrace temple of Deir el-Bahri, copying reliefs cut for a queen called Hatshepsut. 6 seasons. Understand what that work was. It was squatting or lying on scaffolding in a hot, dim place with a sheet of paper, tracing what a dead man had carved, and doing it accurately enough that a scholar in Europe, who would never smell the dust, could read it in a book. The discoveries were other people's. The volumes went out under other people's names. What Carter had, for 8 years, was the pen and the line and the patience, and by the end of it, there was possibly nobody alive who knew the surfaces of those tombs better, because knowing a wall by copying it is a different kind of knowing entirely. It paid off in 1899 all at once. At 25, Gaston Maspero, The Frenchman who ran Egypt's Antiquities Service and who had watched him work made him chief inspector for the whole of Upper Egypt, which turned out to be half scholar and half policeman. He gated tombs. He hired guards and argued about their wages. And on his own initiative, he ran electric light down into the Valley of the Kings, so that visitors would stop carrying open candles into painted rooms that had been dark for 3,000 years, a thoroughly unromantic act that probably saved more ancient paint than any excavation he ever ran. And then, on the 8th of January in 1905, he lost the lot. A party of French visitors came to the burial ground at Saqqara and wanted into the Serapeum, the underground galleries where the sacred bulls were buried. It was closed. They forced past the Ghafirs, the local guards paid to watch the place, and according to Carter, they had been drinking. There was a scuffle in the dark, of which no account survives from the other side. His Egyptian guards defended themselves, and then a complaint went up the chain, and what was wanted from Carter, plainly and from several directions, was an apology on their behalf. He would not give it. He backed his men. He went on backing them well after it stopped being sensible, at which point the service moved him quietly to a post at Tanta down in the delta, a long way from anything he cared about. In the October of that year, he resigned. Then there is a gap of about 4 years in which one of the best draftsmen in Egyptology had no institution behind him at all. There is no record of what he lived on beyond the obvious. He stayed. He sold watercolours to tourists at Luxor, painted the temples for people who wanted a souvenir, which is to say, he was back doing exactly what his father had done, taking commissions from wealthier people for pictures of things they liked. And the stubbornness that ended his career is the same stubbornness that would later sit through 6 empty seasons in a valley everybody had written off. It is one temperament. You do not get to keep the useful half. Meanwhile, in Germany, a rich Englishman had put a motor car into a ditch. His name was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, born in the summer of 1866 into about as much money and as little obligation as England could arrange for a man. He had the great house at Highclere. He had racehorses. And he had the particular enthusiasm of his generation and his class, which was for driving the new machines faster than the roads of the 1890s could support. In 1901, near a German spa town called Bad Schwalbach, one of them turned over on him. The record of exactly what happened is thin, and accounts differ in their details. According to all of them, the result is not in doubt. His chest was crushed. His lungs were damaged in a way that never came right. He walked afterward with a limp, spending the remaining 22 years of his life as what the period called a semi-invalid, a man who looked well enough across a room and was not. His doctors told him what doctors then told everybody with a bad chest, because it was very nearly all they had to offer. Get out of the English winter. Find somewhere dry. Go there every year and stay until the spring. Which is how Lord Carnarvon came to Egypt in 1903. It matters to be honest about why he came. Not for the antiquities, for the air. He came because a doctor sent him, the way people were sent to Switzerland or to the Riviera, and once he was there, he had the problem that the rich have always had in convalescence, which is a great many hours and nothing to put in them. Some men in that position collected. Some drank. He decided to dig. Now, in fairness to him, he threw himself at it. But the Antiquities Service was not going to hand a valuable site to an amateur earl with an interest and a chest complaint. And around 1906, they gave him what the service gave people like him, a patch on a hillside called Sheikh Abd el-Qurna that nobody had any expectation of. Nobody knows whether he understood at the time that it was a polite way of saying no. He worked it for 6 weeks, and at the end of 6 weeks, the total yield of the excavation, everything he had to show for the labour, the money, the permissions, the whole season, was 1 cat. It was a mummified cat, put into a wooden coffin cut to the shape of a cat, which is the detail that gets me every time. Somebody in the ancient world loved an animal enough to have a box made in its likeness and to send it into the next world properly wrapped. And 3,000 years later, a wheezing English aristocrat with nothing else in the trench lifted it out of the ground. He kept it. It is in a museum now. There is no record of what he said when it came up out of the ground. But he also drew the correct conclusion from it. And this is the part that decides everything that follows. He worked out that he did not know what he was doing, that enthusiasm was not going to be enough, that if he wanted the thing done properly, he was going to have to pay somebody who could actually do it. So he went to Lord Cromer, the British Consul General, who effectively ran Egypt at the time. Cromer asked Maspero, who ran the Antiquities Service, and Maspero, who had made Carter an inspector and had watched him throw the job away over a scuffle in the dark, said there was a man down at Luxor who was out of work and selling paintings to tourists, the best draftsman in the country, and quite possibly the best excavator too. They were introduced in 1907. I want to leave that where it is for a moment, because the story we are heading toward is going to be full of enormous causes, a king's curse, 3,000 years of waiting, the anger of a dead god. And underneath all of it, holding up the entire structure, is a bored convalescent, a doctor's advice about damp weather, a cat in a box. What followed was 15 years of ordinary work. I'm going to give it to you honestly, because the ordinariness is the point. From 1907, the two of them worked across the burial grounds on the west bank at Thebes, the Earl paying, the draftsman running it, and they did it properly. They kept records. They published. In 1912, a book came out under both their names, an account of 5 years of digging, with plans and plates and object lists, a perfectly respectable piece of work that almost nobody has read. That same year, the man who held the license to dig in the Valley of the Kings itself put his own conclusion into print. Theodore Davis was an American lawyer who had spent a fortune down there and turned up a great deal, and in a preface he wrote that he was afraid the valley was now exhausted. Everything in it had been found. There was nothing left to look for. That sentence is worth holding on to, because it is one of the most quietly famous wrong guesses ever made by somebody who was not a fool. He had the best information available. He had dug the ground himself for years. Given what anybody knew in 1912, it was the sensible reading. Davis gave up the license in 1914. Carnarvon took it, and then the war took the men and the money, and serious clearance did not really begin until the 1917 season. Then 6 years of nothing. Not nothing in the sense of idleness, nothing in the sense that this is what archaeology mostly is. Gangs of Egyptian workmen went down through the rubble of a valley floor that had been dug over and dumped on for a century, taking it back to the bedrock, square by square, finding chippings, then more chippings. Season after season, the Earl's money went into the ground, and came back as a survey line on a plan, plus a note that this square too was clear. By the summer of 1922, Carnarvon had had enough. He had Carter up to Highclere and told him plainly that it was over. The money had gone on long enough, there was nothing there, and Davis had probably been right all along. And Carter argued. He had a triangle of ground left, one patch in the middle of the valley that had never been taken down to rock, because sitting on top of it were the tumbled stone huts the ancient workmen had lived in while they cut the tomb of Rameses VI just above. Nobody had wanted to pull down the huts. They were themselves ancient, and clearing them would block the path to a tomb that tourists paid to see. He also had a reason to think something was under there. An American archaeologist working in the same valley, Herbert Winlock, had gone back through some embalming material found nearby and read it as the leavings of a burial that ought to be somewhere close. According to several accounts, Carter offered to pay for the season out of his own pocket and to hand over anything he found. Whether it came to that or not, the Earl gave way. One more season. The last one. The work started on the 1st of November, 1922. And I want to put the right people in this room, because the photographs mostly did not. The digging was done by local Egyptian workmen with picks and hoes. The spoil went out on the heads of boys in baskets, in lines, all day, in the heat, often 3 boys to every man, 50 men, and dozens of children on the site at a time. There was no machinery in the Valley of the Kings. There was rope, iron, a great many hands. The work was run day to day by Egyptian foremen, the Rises, whose chief was a man named Ahmed Gerigar, who had been working that valley with Carter since at least 1917. The first week's job was as dull as jobs come, taking down the huts, stone by stone, and carting the stone away to get at the rock underneath. On the 4th of November, Carter came up to the site at about 10 in the morning and found his workmen quiet. That is the detail that survives, better than any dramatization. Not shouting, not running. The site had gone silent, which on a dig with 100 people on it is a very loud thing to happen. Under the floor of the first hut they had taken down, cut into the bedrock, was a step. One step. It was Gerigar who brought him the news, and there is no record anywhere of the words he used to do it. They cleared downward. By the next day, there were 16 steps going down into the rock, and at the bottom of them, a doorway, plastered over and stamped with the seal of the royal burial ground. And here, Carter did the single most disciplined thing of his life. I have always thought it is the most impressive moment in the whole story. He had in front of him the thing he had been looking for since he was 17. He had a sealed door. He ordered the stairway filled back in, put guards on it, rode down to the telegraph office, and sent a message to a man in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Then he waited nearly 3 weeks for Carnarvon to get on a boat. They opened it again at the end of the month. Behind the first door was a corridor packed solid with rubble, and clearing 30 feet of it took days, and behind that was a second sealed door. On the afternoon of the 26th of November, Carter made a small hole in the top left corner of it with an iron rod, tested the air, then put a candle to the opening. Hot air came out and made the flame gutter. He waited for his eyes to settle and looked through. Behind him stood the Earl's daughter, and Carter's assistant, none of whom could see a thing. It is said that Carnarvon could not stand the silence and asked him, Can you see anything? Carter's journal that night gives his answer in 4 words. Yes, it is wonderful. The line most people know, the one about wonderful things, comes from the popular book he wrote the following year, very likely the better telling of a moment he had by then told 1,000 times. But the journal is the journal. A man with his eye at a hole in the dark, with a candle, giving the flattest possible sentence in the English language. Lord Carnarvon lived for another 5 months, and then he did not. The winter that followed the opening was the loudest of his life. The world came to the valley, reporters, tourists, society, the whole apparatus of fame arriving by boat at a place that had been quiet since the Pharaohs, and he was at the centre of it, an ill man of 56 being congratulated from every direction. In the middle of it, sometime in the March of 1923, he was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. There is no record of the day it happened. That happens to everyone in Egypt. It happened to him. Some days later, shaving, he took the top off the bite with the razor. Anybody who has ever shaved has done some version of this, where the ordinary consequence is a small red mark and nothing whatever afterward. He put iodine on it, according to the family account, and got on with the day. It went wrong in the way that things went wrong before there was anything to stop them. The place infected. The infection spread. He ran a fever that broke and came back, then settled into his chest, into the lungs that had been crushed against a German road in 1901 and had never been sound since. They moved him to Cairo, to a room at the Continental Savoy Hotel. His wife came out from England. His son got there in time. The pneumonia arrived on top of the blood poisoning the way it always did in a chest like his. He died at about 2 in the morning on the 5th of April, 1923. 5 months and 9 days after his hole in the wall. He never saw the boy king. That is the part people forget, and the part I would not want you to lose. Carnarvon died with the tomb barely begun, the first room emptied, the burial chamber only just breached, and the coffins were still nested one inside another in the dark, unopened. Carter did not lift the innermost lid until February of 1924, 10 months after the man who paid for all of it was in the ground. Everything you have ever seen, the gold mask, the face, the photographs that went round the world, the Earl saw none of it. And in Cairo, in the small hours, it is said that every light in the city went out. That is what was reported at the time. It was reported again. It has been repeated ever since. It is said, too, that at the same hour, at Highclere, 3,000 miles away, his dog sat up and cried out and died. And it was said, printed, believed, that when the mummy was finally unwrapped, there was a blemish on the boy king's cheek in the same place as the bite. I am going to leave all of that exactly where it sits for now, because you deserve the story the way the world got it. The world got it like this. A man went into a room nobody had entered in 3,000 years. 20 weeks later, he was in a hotel bed in Cairo with a fever, over a scratch that would not close. The lights went out over a whole city. A dog died in England. There is nothing to argue with in a coincidence. That is the trouble with them. You can lay the facts out flat, and they still lean. And it is easy, at 100 years' distance, to be a little superior about the people who read that in the paper over breakfast and felt the back of their neck go cold. I would rather not be. They were not stupid, as we will get to at some length later on. They had the same 3 facts you have just been given, no others. And those three facts sat together very strangely indeed. So, we will let it stand. Something went into that valley, and one of the two men who opened it was gone by the spring. That is where the world was on the 6th of April, 1923. That is where the story properly begins. Before we go anywhere near the newspapers, there is one thread in this that is genuinely real, deserving to be laid out properly rather than waved at. In 1962, a scientist at Cairo University named Ezzeddine Taha announced a finding. He was a microbiologist, somebody who grows things too small to see and then works out what they are. And he had been looking into why people who handled antiquities and old remains kept coming down with the same sorts of illness. According to Taha, he had cultured living fungi off mummified material and off the surfaces of tombs, among them a mold called Aspergillus, which is a common enough thing in the world and an unpleasant thing in a damaged pair of lungs. He was not a crank. The finding was not nonsense. Modern laboratory work has confirmed the general picture. Aspergillus really does turn up on ancient mummified remains in more than one variety. Sealed chambers really do hold air that is nothing like the air outside them, and testing inside closed stone coffins has found ammonia and formaldehyde and hydrogen sulfide, which are not things a person with a bad chest wants to inhale. So the raw material of a mechanism does exist. A shut room, 3,000 years of undisturbed rot, a man with ruined lungs, something alive in the dust. Nobody knows what was actually in the air of that chamber in the November of 1922, because nobody measured it, and it does not fit him. I want to give you the rebuttal in the same breath, because a claim like that left hanging for 10 minutes does its work, whether it is true or not. The epidemiologist F. de Wolf Miller, an epidemiologist being someone who studies how illness moves through a population, who gets sick and who does not, looked at this directly. His conclusion was that Lord Carnarvon would likely have been safer in the tomb than outside, which sounds like a joke and is not one. Cairo in 1923 was a city with real infectious disease in it and no antibiotics anywhere on earth. A sealed rock chamber in a dry valley is, by comparison, a rather clean place, and the timing is wrong in a way that is hard to get around. An acute fungal infection in a vulnerable chest does not wait 5 months and then present as an infected shaving cut. It takes days. Carnarvon entered the tomb in November and died in April, and in between he travelled and dined and gave interviews and went about the ordinary business of a celebrated man, which is not what the course of that illness looks like. He had also been chronically ill for 2 decades before he ever saw the place. There is no evidence that anything from that tomb entered that man. There is a mechanism that could, in principle, harm somebody. There is no case, anywhere in the record, of it harming him. Carter himself went further, and here I have to flag something, because he was not a doctor. In the preface to one of his volumes, written in 1926, he stated that when the tomb was opened, scientific research proved it to be sterile. That is his word, his claim, in his book, 3 years after the fact. And it sits rather awkwardly against everything the laboratories have found since. He wanted the question closed. It was not closed. I am not going to hand you his sentence as microbiology, just because it happens to point the same direction I am pointing. What can honestly be said is smaller than either of them wanted. Something in those chambers can make a person ill. Nobody has ever shown that it made this person ill, and whatever put Lord Carnarvon in that hotel bed arrived on a razor, in a mirror, in a room in Cairo, needing no 3,000 years of anything to do it. The fungus is the only place in this entire story where science and the legend ever touch each other. It is worth knowing that they touch. It is worth knowing just as plainly that they touch and pass by. 3 months before the Earl died, on an ordinary Wednesday in the January of 1923, a London newspaper printed a short notice about itself. It ran under the heading, "The Tomb of the King." I would like to give it to you in its own words, because it is one of those documents that is far stranger read than summarized. We are able to announce that Lord Carnarvon, with the cordial concurrence of Mr. Howard Carter, has entered into an exclusive agreement with the Times for the distribution throughout the press of the world of all news and photographs of his discoveries in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Read the sentence twice, and it starts coming apart in the hand. The distribution throughout the press of the world. Not a sale, not an interview, not a series, not a scoop. One newspaper had bought the right to hand out the story of the century to every other newspaper on earth, and was announcing this to them, in print, on a Wednesday morning. And the reason given for it is very nearly tender. Both men, the notice explains, have found it an impossible task to supply the press individually with news and illustrations of their discoveries. You can almost hear the sigh in it. There were simply so many of you. So, it goes on. Accordingly, they have agreed for the future to employ a single agency for this purpose. A single agency. That is the word the paper chose for itself, an agency, as though the Times of London had been appointed postman to the world and had accepted the position out of duty. Notice, too, who the parties are. Carnarvon, in London, who signed it, and Carter, at Luxor, who is entered into the record at second hand, as having offered his cordial concurrence, a phrase that has never in the history of the language meant enthusiasm. Nobody knows what he actually thought of it. There is no record of him being asked. Now, what was paid for it? 2 figures live in the literature. One of them is repeated constantly in the popular histories and cannot be traced back to any original document. The other appears in an academic journal, in an article by the historian Christina Riggs, and it is different and larger. I am not going to put either number in your ear as a fact, because I do not know which is right, and neither does anybody I have read. What survives, whichever figure you take, is the shape of the deal, which is the whole point. It was not a fee. It was a fee plus a cut. Every other paper in the world that wanted to print a photograph of the boy king paid the Earl's excavation for the privilege of doing it. Carnarvon had been sinking money into that valley for 15 years, and in January of 1923 he acquired a royalty on everybody else's coverage of his own discovery. The arrangement took in the illustrated weeklies as well as the dailies, words and pictures, the whole market, at once. And a Times man, Arthur Merton, was put onto the excavation staff, so that the reporter holding the exclusive was formerly a member of the dig he was reporting on. According to Riggs, the deal offended the Egyptian press and angered rival papers in Britain and America. I want to be careful with the first half of that, and rather more careful out loud than quietly. That grievance survives in a British scholar's summary of it. In all the research behind tonight, there is no record of an Egyptian journalist by name, no Egyptian editor quoted, no Egyptian newspaper cited on the subject of this contract. It is a gap in the record, and it is not a small one. The country whose ancestors were in that room, reading about them in a paper it had to buy from London. I am not going to invent a voice to put in it. I am going to tell you the voice is missing. So go back to the men at the rope. That is what those men were doing there. Every reporter in the valley who did not work for one London paper had been shut out by contract, from the tomb, from the finds, from the photographs, from the story, and was standing in the sun with a camera and an editor cabling him daily for copy. Shutters, a water wheel, 100 professional writers in the greatest story of their lives, with absolutely nothing they were permitted to write about. They were not going to file nothing. Nobody has ever filed nothing. Here is the thing that surprised me most in all of this, and the reason I no longer think of 1923 as the year anybody invented anything. The story was already written. It had been running on and off in an American newspaper for 19 years before Howard Carter ever lit that candle. There was an object in the British Museum, and it is worth being precise about what it is, because almost nothing said about it has ever been true. It is not a mummy. It is a mummy board, a painted wooden cover shaped like a person that lay over a body about 3,000 years ago. The woman it was made for is unidentified, and the board has never left the building. Nevertheless, on a Sunday in the June of 1904, a Washington paper ran a long feature about the unlucky priestess whose portrait it was, along with the misfortunes that had followed everyone who came near her. It ran the story again in 1908, again in 1910, and again in the May of 1912, 5 weeks after the Titanic went down, under a headline announcing that the vengeance of the mummy had followed the man who wrote its history. The museum, over the years, has had to state publicly that the board was not aboard the Titanic. It has also had to state that it was not aboard the Lusitania, and that it was not aboard the Empress of Ireland. A wooden lid in a display case in Bloomsbury has been reported lost in 3 separate ocean disasters. Look at how the first of those pieces was built, because the architecture is the whole trick, and it has not been improved on since. It was written by a journalist named Bertram Fletcher Robinson, who is remembered now mainly for having worked with Arthur Conan Doyle on The Hound of the Baskervilles. His method was to assert everything and show nothing, which he said himself in the article out loud. I have now in my possession proofs of the identity of all those who suffered from the anger of the priestess of Amun-Ra. But for the sake of friends and relatives, I have been requested to suppress the names. I have the proof. I cannot show you the proof. I am withholding it out of kindness. There is no way to argue with that sentence. There is no way to check it either, which is not a flaw in it. That is the design. Robinson died of typhoid 3 years later, and was promptly added to the list of the priestess's victims by other writers, which tells you how the machine handled its own staff. There is no record of anyone objecting. So when the Earl died in April of 1923, the World's editors were not casting about for an angle. They had a 19-year-old format sitting in the file, tested 4 times, with the headlines already written. What they needed was somebody respectable to say it first. They got Marie Corelli. She was, at that point, one of the best-selling novelists in Britain, outselling most of the men whose names have lasted. And she wrote to the press with a warning and a question. She had, she said, a very old book about Egypt that she had owned for 30 years, which described dire punishment for anyone who broke into a sealed tomb. The book was real. It was a French translation, printed in the 1600s, of a medieval Arabic history of Egypt. Her memory of what it said was, by every modern reading, wrong. And then she asked the question that did the damage, days before he died. Was it a mosquito bite that so seriously affected Lord Carnarvon? I have to be careful with the date here, rather than dramatic, because the 12-day version of this story is better than the truth might be. According to one writer, her statement appeared in a New York paper in the March of that year. The Egyptologist Joyce Tildesley places it in a London paper on the 24th of March. If the second is right, then the most famous prophecy of the 20th century came 12 days before the thing it prophesied. If the first is right, it preceded it by rather more. Nobody knows which is right, and I am not going to settle it for you tonight. Then, on the day the Earl actually died, a wire went out from New York and ran in a Chicago paper the following morning, saying that the boy King might have sent something after the man who found him. The source was Arthur Conan Doyle. The ancient Egyptians were very anxious to guard the tombs of their kings. There is reason to believe that they placed elementals on guard, and such may have caused Lord Carnarvon's death. That is the creator of Sherlock Holmes on the subject of evidence. I will leave it there. And there was a third desk, and this is the one that has always seemed saddest to me. Arthur Weigel was an Egyptologist who had held Carter's old job as inspector and who was in Egypt that season working as a correspondent, which is to say, he was on the outside of the rope, with everybody else, watching a former colleague go down a staircase he was not allowed near. He wrote about the tomb atmospherically. Carter, years later and privately, is said to have accused him of manufacturing the curse for money, and when Weigel died in 1934 of an illness, he was added to the list of the tomb's victims by the same press he had been writing for. Now, it would be very easy to point at one of those three and call it the source. I do not think that is what happened, and I do not think the record supports it. Corelli was reaching for attention. Doyle was reaching for a spiritualist point he had been making for years. Weigel was reaching for a column he could sell from the wrong side of a rope. The papers were reaching for a front page they had been contractually denied. There is no record that any of them ever conspired with any of the others, and none of them needed to, because they all wanted the same thing at the same time, and there was nothing else on offer. The reading that has stayed with me is Tildesley's, which is deflating in the best way. The supernatural story, she argues, is a side effect of a business contract. Nobody sat down to build a legend. 100 people were shut out of a story. Then the deadline came anyway. No villain required. Just an empty notebook and a morning edition. Once a story like that is running, it needs feeding, and this one turned out to be very easy to feed. Because the list started growing, not in a week, over years, then over decades, one name at a time, each new name making the whole thing look a little more solid than it had the month before. Arthur Mace was an American archaeologist on Carter's own staff, one of the men who actually did the work in that tomb. He became ill, left the excavation in 1924 on health grounds, and died a few years later. He went onto the list. What did not go onto the list, according to one museum's account of him, was that he had had a lung complaint for a long time, long-standing, known about, nothing whatever to do with Egypt. The illness was in the story. The prior illness was not. Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey went onto the list as well. He was shot by his wife in a suite at a famous London hotel during a thunderstorm in the July of 1923. The trial that followed filled the papers for a season. There is no record that he had ever been to the Valley of the Kings. There is no record that he had ever met Howard Carter. He was Egyptian, he was rich, he came to a bad end in a place people had heard of. That was sufficient. Museum curators went onto the list who had never been within 1,000 miles of that tomb. And it kept going. Names were added through the 1930s, through the 40s, later still, including, decades on, an antiquities official who fell ill long after every person who had stood in that room was already gone. There was never a closing date, because there was never anything that could close it. There is no record of a definitive version of the list either. It comes out different in every telling. Look at what is actually required to get onto a list like that. A connection to Egypt, loosely defined. An illness or an accident, any illness, any accident. That is the entire entrance requirement. Nobody at any point, in 100 years, had to demonstrate that a given death had anything to do with a given tomb. And here is the part that makes it a machine rather than a rumour. Nothing could ever come off the list. No survival counted. Every one of the people who went into that place and lived a long, ordinary life afterward simply was not mentioned, not disputed, not explained away, just never entered in the ledger at all. A story that admits every death as evidence and admits no life as evidence against it is not a weak claim. It is a claim built so that nothing can get at it. There is a good deal of decent research on why this works so well, and none of it is flattering to any of us, which is why I want to hand it over gently. The first piece is a habit of mind that scientists call illusory correlation, which is a stiff name for something you have done this week, seeing two things travel together when they do not. The cleanest demonstration anybody has produced is not about curses at all. It is about arthritis and the weather. According to the researchers Donald Redelmeyer and Amos Tversky, the position is very plain. They put it in their paper like this: there is a widespread and strongly held belief that arthritis pain is influenced by the weather. However, scientific studies have found no consistent association. So they took 18 patients and followed them for a year, and let each patient nominate, in advance, the weather they believed made their own joints worse. Then they simply recorded the pain and recorded the weather. There was no meaningful association. A review of the whole field, more than a decade later, found the same thing at the group level, close to nothing. Now sit with the size of that, because it is the actual finding, and it is not. People are foolish. Nearly everybody with sore joints believes the weather moves them. Many of them will tell you they can feel a front coming in, and when you write it down day by day for a year, the pattern is not there. The belief is near universal. The signal is near zero. The people holding the belief are in no other respect wrong about their own bodies. That is how strong the pull is toward joining up two things that happened near each other. The second piece is about what happens to a belief when the evidence starts arriving. Researchers who study cherished beliefs have found that people do not simply abandon them under pressure. They tend instead to move them somewhere the evidence cannot reach, and they do it more, not less, when the facts start to press. Philosophers of science have a name for the end state of that process, a belief that predicts its own lack of evidence. Of course, you cannot find the mechanism. Of course, the deaths look ordinary. That is what a curse would look like, which is exactly the shape this one has. It works slowly. It works through razors and lung complaints and hotel rooms. It never leaves a mark you could take to anybody. You cannot test that, and a claim you cannot test, held by people who very much want to hold it, does not get weaker with time. It gets more comfortable. Somebody did try counting. Before we get to him, two small pieces of housekeeping, because they are the easiest things in this whole story to take apart, and they are the two that people remember best. The lights of Cairo. Cairo's electricity supply in 1923 failed regularly in the ordinary way of early municipal power, so that a cut on any given night was worth no remark at all from anybody who lived there. It became remarkable only because of who died that night, which is the direction of causation running backwards through the story rather than forwards. And the dog. Lord Carnarvon's dog, Susie, did die at Highclere, and according to the Egyptologists who have gone back through it, the arithmetic on the clocks settles the matter. Allowing for the hours between Cairo and England, she died about 4 hours after her master, not at the same moment. 4 hours is not a portent. 4 hours is a very old dog dying on the day it happened to die. Which brings us to Herbert Winlock, who had put Carter onto that last triangle of ground in the first place, and who by 1934 had had enough. He did what nobody in 11 years of headlines had bothered to do. He counted. He took the people who were actually in the burial chamber when it was opened. According to his count, 26 of them, named, present, in the room. Of those 26, 6 had died in the 11 years since, and going through them one at a time, Winlock found that every one of the 6 had a documented illness beforehand that had nothing to do with any of it. Then he did the part that finishes the argument. He took the group with the deepest exposure of anybody on earth, the 10 people who stood over the boy king himself when he was unwrapped. Not the room, the body. Hands on it, faces above it, breathing the dust of it for hours. Of those 10 in 11 years, none had died. Sit with the direction of that. If there were anything in that tomb that reached for people, then the 10 who put their hands on the mummy were the 10 it should have taken first, and instead, they are the group that came through cleanest of all. The most exposed people had the best survival. The arithmetic does not merely fail to support the curse, it runs the wrong way down it. Winlock published that in a New York paper, in a column of plain figures, and millions of people could have read it. It changed essentially nothing. The story grew for another 70 years straight through it. We will come to why in a moment, because that is really the interesting question of the night. Then, in 2002, somebody did it properly. An Australian doctor named Mark Nelson published a study in a medical journal, built the dull, correct way, as a cohort study, which means this. You take a defined group of people, sort them by whether they were exposed to the thing under suspicion, then simply watch what happens over the rest of their lives. He used the 44 Westerners Carter himself recorded as being in Egypt at the time. He defined exposure by 4 specific moments the record could pin down: the breaking of the seals, the opening of the stone coffin, the opening of the nested coffins, the examination of the body, Then he compared how long they lived. According to the paper, the average age at death among the exposed was 70, among the unexposed 75. And the difference, once you account for how few people are in the study, is statistically indistinguishable from no difference at all. Survival after exposure came out the same way. There was no association between being in that tomb and dying any sooner than anybody else. It is about as unglamorous a piece of work as science produces, which is precisely its virtue. Nobody argued. Nobody was ridiculed. A man wrote down some dates and did the subtraction. And Nelson names the hole in his own study, which I think is to his enormous credit, so I am going to name it too. Every person in his cohort is Western. Carter recorded the Europeans and the Americans. He did not, in his published volumes, record the men who actually dug, the 50 or so Egyptian workmen with picks, the dozens of boys carrying rock out in baskets, the foreman who ran the site. Their names are almost entirely absent from the running text of the book that made him famous. Their wages are not recorded anywhere at all. So when we say the numbers show nothing happened to the people who opened that tomb, we should be honest about which people we counted. Not one study on this subject, not Nelson's, not anybody's, has an Egyptian workman in the denominator. Nobody knows what became of them, because nobody wrote it down. That is not a curse. That is something duller, and I think sadder. There is one more piece of arithmetic, the plainest of all. A shaving cut that goes bad and reaches the blood is, today, an inconvenience and a course of tablets. In 1923, there were no tablets. There was no penicillin anywhere in the world and would not be for another 20 years. Blood poisoning in that era killed ordinary people, ordinarily, all the time. Grazed knees, kitchen accidents, a scratch from a rose. Add a chest that had been crushed against a road in 1901 and had been failing quietly ever since. Add a man of 56 in a Cairo spring. He is not an anomaly requiring an explanation. He is what the ordinary odds of 1923 looked like on a morning when they happened to catch somebody famous. So the counting was done. The counting was published. The story went on growing for 70 years anyway. That is the fact I keep coming back to, the one that turns this from a story about Egypt into a story about something much closer to home. The evidence was available in 1934. In a newspaper millions of people took, laid out in figures a child could follow. It did not dent the thing at all. So, the plain answer must be unsatisfying in some way that has to be accounted for. Whatever is wrong with it, it beat the arithmetic for a century, and things that beat arithmetic for a century are worth understanding. Here is what I think is wrong with it, which is roughly what the people who study belief have been circling for years. A mosquito bite is a very small thing. It is a bump on a cheek. A razor is a small thing too, an ordinary object on a washstand, in a hotel room, on a March morning like every other March morning of a man's life. And on the other side of the scale is the man who found Tutankhamun. Those two will not sit level. Put them on a balance, and the balance will not settle. And something in a mind goes looking for more weight to put under the small side. Something with the same heft as an earl and a boy king and 3,000 years of dark. A curse has exactly that heft. It is a cause built to the size of the consequence. Psychologists have a name for that pull, though the name matters less than the shape. and I should say plainly that nobody knows how large the effect is once it leaves a laboratory. The bigger the outcome, the bigger the cause people will reach for to explain it, and the reaching happens before anybody has looked at any evidence at all. Where the specifics are cleanest is a study that changed one thing and held everything else still. A pair of psychologists, Lehman and Cinderella, gave people an account of an attack on a public figure. Same facts, same circumstances, same evidence, described in the same words. One difference: in one version the man survived, and in the other version he did not. According to the study, belief that something larger was going on rose only in the second version. Nothing else moved. The evidence in front of the reader was identical. What changed was the size of the hole the event left, which then determined how big an explanation people went looking for. And this is the part I would not want anybody to skate past. The effect ran on everybody in the room. Whether a person already believed in real-world conspiracy theories predicted nothing about how they responded. There was no credulous subgroup driving it, and no sensible subgroup immune to it. It is not a study about other people. There is a second thing underneath it, having less to do with arithmetic than with how a year feels. According to a set of experiments published in a leading science journal in 2008, when people are deprived of a sense of control over their own circumstances, they start seeing patterns in places where the researchers have carefully put none. Shown visual static with no image in it, they see images. Shown made-up stock market figures with no relationship in them, they report relationships. They see conspiracies. They form superstitions. 6 experiments, all pointing the same way. Take away a person's control, and their pattern finding goes up, not down. Now put that against the world of 1923. A generation had just come through a war it did not choose, and an influenza that took whoever it took, with very little any ordinary person could do about any of it. Then a newspaper laid out a set of facts on a page. A man opens a sealed room. A man dies of an infected scratch. The lights of a city go out. A dog stops in England. Those 4 things have nothing to do with each other, but they were printed near each other, in a season when almost nobody felt they had much say over anything, and a mind that is short of control will join up 4 points on a page without being asked to. It is not an error of intelligence. It is a system doing exactly what it evolved to do, in a room where somebody has quietly removed the pattern. The story was never really about a tomb. The tomb was just the sturdiest available place to hang something people were carrying anyway. And there is one more reason a curse is worth having, which has nothing to do with newspapers and everything to do with what the other sentence costs to say out loud. In 2004, a team of researchers in Britain sat down with 45 people who had been given a diagnosis of lung cancer and asked them not about treatment, but about how it felt to carry the thing around. What came back was not fear of the illness, or not mainly, it was shame. According to the interviews, patients felt particularly stigmatized, set apart, judged, met with a particular expression across a desk or a dinner table. Many of them said they felt unjustly blamed. Some concealed the diagnosis altogether, from friends and from employers, and in a number of cases that concealment cost them real money. And here is the finding that I have not been able to put down. That happened regardless of the person's own history, including the people who had never smoked at all. Never once. They carried the judgment anyway, because the judgment had attached itself to the illness rather than to the person waiting there for whoever turned up with it? So that is the price of the plain explanation. That is what it costs, at a kitchen table, to say the true and ordinary thing about how a body wore out. Now think about what a curse offers instead. A curse is enormous and ancient and impersonal, and this is the whole of it, nobody's fault. It arrives from 3,000 years away, aimed by somebody long dead, settling on a person the way weather settles on a field. There is no washstand in it. There is no razor, and no cigarette, and no 40 years of anything. It is a sentence a person can say out loud in a room full of people they love, and not lose anything by saying it. The curse of the Pharaohs was never really about pharaohs. It is the size of thing people reach for when the honest account of an ending is small and domestic and theirs. There is research on the other side of that too, and it is less comfortable. When people hold what researchers call fatalistic beliefs, meaning the settled sense that it is going to happen to whoever it happens to, with nothing much to be done, that outlook has been linked with doing less of the small, ordinary things, less walking, less of the fruit and the vegetables. Not because anyone decided to give up, but because effort is hard to justify in a world where the outcome was already posted. I want to be straight about the state of that argument rather than tidy about it, because it is not settled. According to a serious line of work in the field, fatalistic talk is face-saving rather than causal. People say it after the fact, to have something to say, rather than living by it beforehand. Roughly 2 studies in 3 find the link to inaction. A minority find no link at all. But notice that even the objection lands in the same place. Face-saving is simply the academic term for a sentence a person can say out loud without shame, which is exactly what a curse is and exactly what it is for. And now the part I would ask you to hold on to, because everything tonight has been building toward it, and it is not a scolding. According to a body of research on how people actually explain things, supernatural explanations and natural ones do not compete for a single slot in a mind. They are not rivals. People hold both at once, comfortably, and the endorsement of both together is at its most common, not in children, but in adults. So, think of the reader in 1923, over the tea and the toast, taking in the mosquito bite and the lights and the dog, and feeling the back of the neck go cold. That person was not a fool, and was very probably capable of telling you in the same breath that the Earl had died of blood poisoning. Both things were in there. Both things are usually in there. They were reading a newspaper at breakfast, in the fast, associative way anyone reads a newspaper at breakfast. The story had been built, over 19 years, by professionals with a headline already tested 4 times, precisely for the mode they were reading in. There is no version of this where somebody was stupid. There is only a version where a machine was well made, a mind was doing the thing minds do, and the true explanation was the one nobody wanted to have to say. Which leaves the other man. While all of that was being printed, the priestess, the elementals, the roll call, the lot of it, Howard Carter was in a hole in the ground, working. The tomb held 5,398 objects. Every one of them had to be photographed where it lay, then drawn, measured, numbered, and written up on a card, then treated so it would not come apart in the air, packed, and carried out. It took about 10 years. 10 years in the dark, on his knees with a pen. Think about the shape of a life that ends up there. A boy is taught to draw by his father because the family cannot afford a school. He is put to work inking another man's tracings at 17. He spends 8 years copying walls other men found. He loses a career over a scuffle at a door and sells watercolours to tourists for 4 years. He digs an empty valley for 6 seasons on somebody else's money, and then he finds the thing, and what the finding buys him is another decade of exactly the same work he has done since he was a boy, which is the careful recording of an object by hand. That hand is at the centre of this entire story, never once having done anything dramatic. All of it survives. According to the archive that holds them, everything came to an institution in Oxford called the Griffith Institute. The diaries, the plans, the thousands of object cards in his own handwriting. A niece of his, Phyllis Walker, left it to them. You can look at them. Anybody can. The measurements of a boy king's belongings in the hand of a man who was taught to draw dogs. And no one in the world had more of that tomb on their skin than Howard Carter. He was there first. He made the hole. He breathed that air before it had moved for 3,000 years. Carter was in the burial chamber and over the coffins. He was there when the body itself was uncovered. He was in and out of that place for a decade afterward, day after day, handling everything in it. If there were anything there, anything at all, it had him first. It had him longest. It had him more than anybody. Howard Carter died in bed in London on the 2nd of March in 1939 of natural causes at the age of 64. That is 17 years after he put a candle to a hole in a wall. He had by then outlived Carnarvon by 16 years, outlived Weigel, outlived most of the writers who had made a living out of the story, and outlived the newspaper contract that started it. And the legend had nothing whatever to say about it. He simply is not in it. Not as a survivor, because survival is not a category the story keeps. Not as a puzzle, because a puzzle would need an answer. The man who was most exposed to the thing that supposedly reached out and took people was quietly left off both lists. There is no record of anybody at the time remarking on the omission. The story went on perfectly well without him. An ordinary death in an ordinary bed in a city in March. The most unremarkable ending in the whole of this, belonging to the one person the curse should have had least trouble finding. And now, the thing I have been keeping. In the tomb, there was a small room the excavators called the treasury, and on its floor, just inside the doorway, between the carrying poles of a sledge with a black jackal lying on it, was a lump of mud. Carter numbered it Object 263. The card he filled in for it is still in the archive, in the ordinary handwriting of a man who had filled in thousands of them. According to that card, it was a brick of sun-dried mud, a little over 8 centimetres long and 4 wide, about 1 centimetre thick. Set into it, upright, was a small reed torch with a gilded top, about the length of a hand, and at the bottom of the card, in the same flat register as everything else, the note that the excavator wrote because it was true and not because it was moving. Some grains of charcoal on ground beside it. Somebody had lit it. 3,000 years ago, somebody set a little torch into a lump of wet mud, put a flame to it for a moment, set it down on the floor by the door. A few black grains stayed on the ground beside it. Nobody moved them again until 1922. There were 4 more of the same idea in that tomb, and those 4 are are the ones that matter. They were sealed into niches cut in the walls of the burial chamber itself, one to a side. Small bricks of the same cheap mud, each carrying a different little figure, each carrying a line of text. Those four are the origin of everything you have heard tonight. Every headline, every roll call, every line about death coming on swift wings, which was never written on anything in that tomb by anybody. It appears in no photograph, no notebook, no field card from it. The famous inscription does not exist. What exists is 4 bricks of mud. So what does the writing on them actually say? It is not a warning. It is not addressed to anybody living. It is a spell, the 151st chapter of the collection we call the Book of the Dead, the section belonging to the torch, and its purpose is the protection of the person lying in the room. According to a modern translation, the words run like this: I am the one who snares the sand at the wall of the hidden chamber. I am the protector of the Osiris-En. The Osiris, because every Egyptian who died became, in the ritual, a version of the god Osiris, with the letter standing in for whoever the dead person happens to be. Fill in the name. It is a form, the way a prayer card is a form, and what the form says is, I am standing here so that nothing gets in. Not a threat to the living, a guard facing outward for the person on the bed. And then there is the detail that finishes the argument altogether. So plain that once you have seen it, you cannot see the legend the same way again. The spell comes with its own instructions for use, and Carter transcribed them himself. The brick is to be put in a niche cut into the wall, and then, in the ancient text's own words, a hole is made for it in the east wall, its face towards the west, and it is covered up. Covered up, hidden, plastered in and painted over, which is exactly what was done in that tomb, and Carter proved it with evidence so small it is almost tender. The niches had been cut before the walls were decorated. They were closed with limestone chips, and then, as he wrote, plastered over flush with the surfaces of the walls and painted to match. His proofs were splashes of yellow paint inside the niches, a slight mismatch in the covering plaster, and, this is the one I love, the name of a single painted ape on the west wall left unfinished, because the open niche had been in the artist's way. So consider what that means. The most feared text of the last 100 years was sealed inside a wall and painted over, in the dark, in a room that was itself then sealed, in a tomb that was then filled in and hidden. It could not have been a sign on a door. Nobody was ever meant to read it. There is no record of anybody reading it between the day it was plastered in and the day Carter took the wall apart. And one of the 4 is better than all of it. The brick in the middle of the west wall carried a small, crouching figure of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who guarded the dead, the shape every curse story has reached for ever since. Carter examined that one and wrote in his notes that it bears no incantation nor inscription whatsoever, nothing written on it at all. He thought the little figure had simply taken up all the room there was. The whole thing rests on a lump of mud with nothing on it. Carter answered all of this himself once, in print, and then never bothered again. In the preface to the 2nd volume of his account of the tomb, signed in November of 1926, he set down what the ritual actually asks of a living person who comes upon the dead. So far as the living are concerned, curses of this nature have no place in the Egyptian ritual. On the contrary, we are piously desired to express our benevolent wishes for the dead. That is the end of it. It took 100 years to come back around to what was written on the object in the first place. Somebody, a very long time ago, was frightened for a boy who had died young, and did what people do. They made something small with their hands, out of the cheapest material there is. They set a light in it. They said the words over it, hid it in a wall so that nothing could disturb it, painted the wall to match. Then the room was closed. The sand came down over the door, and it held. There was never anything down there wishing anybody harm. There was a wish, in mud, that the dead be let alone. The same wish the whole world has always had, said in the plainest way anyone has ever said it, and kept for 3,000 years in the dark. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake, and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review, if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction, if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet, and let yourself rest. I will be here when you would like.